First, Sean Jillians, who is not me, is the president of the Jillians Group. His practice focuses on representing a select group of clients before all levels of elected and appointed government entities in Oregon and Washington, D.C. Sean was an attorney and partner with several Portland-based law firms prior to being named executive director of the trade association Oregon Manufacturers and Commerce and forming Jillians Group LLC in 2019. He previously served as vice president of public policies for one of Oregon's largest trade associations, the Oregon Association of Realtors. He has significant experience in analyzing and preparing legislation on land use and natural resource issues. In addition, he served as a lobbyist before the Nevada Legislative Assembly and began his formal political career as chief of staff to the chair of the Oregon House Committee on Water. Sean received his BA in Communications, summa cum laude, from San Diego State University, and his JD from the University of California Hastings College of Law. California, huh? Cool. He has been a member of the Oregon State Bar since 2004. Jeremy Rogers, who is our political advocacy director and staff counsel here at OAR. Prior to that, Jeremy was vice president of the Oregon Business Council, where he worked with executives at some of Oregon's largest companies on public policy, including education, healthcare, taxation, poverty reduction, and state budget policies. In that role, Jeremy managed the Oregon Business Plan and the annual Oregon Leadership Summit, a statewide effort to bring private and public sector leaders together around a common vision and a set of policies to strengthen Oregon's economy. Jeremy serves as the chair of the board of REAP, a multicultural youth leadership and development program helping students in the Portland region, and also on the board of governors of the Portland City Club. Jeremy grew up in Oregon as a graduate of Tigard High School. He has his bachelor's degree in politics and government from the University of Puget Sound, and a JD from Lewis and Clark Law School. So I think, gentlemen, I've used up as much time as I possibly can, and we'll let you take it away.
Thanks, Adam.
We on? There we go.
Great.
Well, that was a fabulous introduction to the two of us. You all are very brave, all five of you who are in here listening to two lawyer lobbyists prattle on for an hour and a half. We'll try and get you out a little early, but make sure you get all your CE credit time.
Now, just before we start, who has heard us do this spiel before?
Oh, good.
Okay.
It won't be a repeat.
All right, good,
Yeah.
great. Just so you know, after we go through this today, if you want to find additional information about the 2019 legislative session, there is a webinar online, and we have a legislative report in the back as well. So we'll start. I guess I've got the clicker. So how closely do you all track politics in the legislature? Well, yeah. Schwend, chair of your political Action Committee. So this session, after the 2018 election, ended up with 38 Democrats in the Oregon House of Representatives and 22 Republicans. And in the Senate, it was 18 Democrats, 12 Republicans. So that is a supermajority of Democrats in both houses. A supermajority is significant because Oregon Constitution requires that there be a supermajority of votes in favor of tax increases. So it's a very important goal for political parties to try to achieve supermajority. So the Democrats came into the legislative session riding very high, having that ability to raise taxes. This was the first time since 1983 with a supermajority in both chambers. There's been times since then where there was a supermajority in one chamber or the other. And as recently as 2010, there was actually a split in the House of Representatives, 30-30 Republican and Democrat. So things have gone pretty far in one direction since then, and this was the first session with this kind of dominance that we've seen in quite a while.
And for those of you who've heard sort of me talk about the historical view of Oregon Association of Realtors and sort of our legislative interaction, I always talk about that 30-30 session as being one of our most successful sessions. Really required both parties to actually talk to each other. They couldn't pass any legislation without working with the other side. And the Senate was actually split 16-14 when the House was 30-30. And the Senate president evenly divided some of his committees as well. And so, a lot of pundits were saying that Oregon was going to be gridlock. We actually received national accolades for that. The two co-speakers, Bruce Hanna and Arnie Roblin, received national awards for how well they worked together. I think that was really telling. It's a stark contrast to where we are now, where, quite frankly, you have the politics of Portland driving the discussion for everything in the state, and the vast majority of our leadership in the Legislative Assembly is all from the city of Portland. Our governor is from Portland, and so you really have sort of this Portland-centric model coming down with a supermajority in the House that it's important, as Jeremy mentioned, the 3/5 for tax increases, but even more importantly was the majority was so large that historically committees are divided by a single vote in the majority party. So the Housing Committee would be 6-5, 6 Democrats, 5 Republicans. This time they made it 7-4, and other committees were 6-3. And so there really was no need or desire on behalf of many of the chairs to even consult with the minority party because their votes didn't matter to them. And we saw a really divisive, fractured sort of outcome, particularly in the House, around those divisions.
So when the legislature began, there was some key priorities that the Democratic majorities were focused on accomplishing with the new supermajorities. And probably well, a lot of them were big ticket items, but one of the biggest was a business tax to increase school funding. So for the year prior, well, let's take a step back. Since the passage of Measure 5 in Oregon in 1990, 92, I think it was 90, yeah, the burden for school funding shifted in part from local government to the state, where the state taking on a larger role in the share of school funding because property taxes were limited by Measure 5 and Measure 50 and subsequent measures. At the same time, we started seeing a major problem with our public pension system that started eating up more and more of the funding that otherwise would be available at the state level to pay for schools because of very rich benefit structure that sort of caught up with us when the market crashed in 2001 and again in 2008. So you had these combination of factors going on, putting a tremendous amount of pressure on the state around school funding, and it's really defined a lot of Oregon politics for the last 20 or 30 years. Schools, always the top issue that people are campaigning on when they run for office, and always a huge debate about whether our schools just need more money, they need to spend the money they have better, we need to reform the pension system so there's more resources for the schools, some combination of all of that. And this legislative session was the moment that the legislative leaders really wanted to do something significant on that issue. And so for the year prior to the legislative session beginning, there was a committee that was set up called the Joint Committee on Student Success. That committee traveled all over the state, met with parents and with students and with union members and with business leaders and others, getting input about what do our schools need to improve. Not how to pay for it, but what are the programs we should be offering if we had more resource. Then for the last few years, really since Measure 97, which was a ballot measure that was on the ballot in 2016 that would have created a large gross receipts tax of 2.5%, which was pretty extreme policy, raised like $6 billion for each budget period. It got soundly defeated by voters. But the concept of a gross receipts tax sort of became the focus of the how to pay for school funding. And so that joint committee did its work, and then a legislative committees in the legislature started working on the tax piece of it, and they came forward with another type of gross receipts tax. We'll talk about it a little bit more later. And then a bill that would specify how those dollars would be spent on schools. And so that was a huge piece of the legislative session. I'd say the first half of the session was really dominated by that conversation, and then moved on to some other things that we'll talk about. Another one was Medicaid funding. So Oregon expanded its Medicaid program about 6-7 years ago as part of the Affordable Care Act passed at the federal level. So Medicaid is health care for low-income Oregonians. We added about 400,000 people to that by lowering the income thresholds that allow people to qualify for Medicaid. But we never had a permanent way of paying for it. And so the federal government was paying for it for the initial part of that period under the Affordable Care Act, but that started ramping down a few years ago. And so now Oregon's been in a constant struggle to figure out how to pay for that. So that was another huge piece of the puzzle that the legislature was working on. They landed on insurance premium taxes and hospital taxes to pay for that. Then the next big one, greenhouse gas regulation pricing. I'll let Sean talk a little bit about that.
So that's commonly referred to as cap and trade. I think we'll get into that one a little bit later, but you really did see Jeremy sort of pointing out the four big issues. Cap and trade came in. That really was the first thing they were going to work on. They had planned to have the bill on the governor's desk by Earth Day, which is April 20th. Our session started in January, and there was a big push. And as that slowed down, then you saw cap and trade get pushed to the side. They worked the gross receipts tax and got that through, and then came back to cap and trade. The paid family leave program that came in at the very end was a late addition, sort of at the insistence of one of the state's largest business associations. And the Medicaid funding, actually they had a deal pretty early on. It was only $600 million in new taxes. That's nothing for the legislature in this environment, and so they passed that in the first few weeks of session.
Yeah, and the combination of this is quite ambitious for the Democrats to try to achieve because I think, during the course of the session, some business groups sort of added up the totality of the new tax and cost increases from all of these measures, and it was something like $5 billion. That didn't all pass, but most of it did.
Yeah.
And so it was, I can't recall a legislative session where leaders came in wanting to accomplish so much and thinking that they could accomplish so much.
And just for perspective, our general fund budget, I think, was around $17 billion last budget cycle, and we're talking about a $5 to $6 billion increase in a single legislative session. So when people sort of hear me cry about a terrible session, that's really what we were faced with.
And of course, housing too was, and we'll talk a lot about those bills here in detail, but was an important priority for legislative leaders as well. So I just want to talk a little bit about our process here at OAR. So we have legislative,
It's not on your computer.
we have legislative policies that are adopted by the board of directors. They're not, specific legislation. They are sort of policy principles and issues that and priorities, and then we use those to sort of guide our decision making about which legislation we support and which legislation we advance. We have a government affairs key committee that meets every couple weeks, at least by phone, during the legislative session to keep track. We read through all the bills that are out there that affect the industry, that either line up with or against our legislative policies and priorities. And we work through that committee to take positions in support, in opposition, to work on amendments. And so it's a very active member-involved process, and that committee puts in hours of work, and they really do read bills, they get into the details, and so it's a really good member-driven process. We also have a political affairs key committee. Adam chairs that. That committee is focused on really the kind of grassroots efforts and the turning out people to talk to their legislators about our legislative priorities. So that committee puts on Realtor Day at the Capitol, where we had, I think think it was like 850 realtors came to Salem, met with the governor, met with all of the legislators, got some CE credit and training, learned about the bills that were going through the legislature. So we've talked to our peers in other states. That number, I mean, 850 realtors out of just over 17,000 that we have as members is a really, really high turnout. And so really proud of all of your efforts to help support the government affairs work. And it's noticed. I mean, legislators say I've never seen that many people show up to the legislature before. So.
During that day, there was a huge group of gun control folks. And do you know how many numbers they brought out?
So the question was, the gun control folks had they had hearings that day too. So there was a rally and hearings there. It was, for that particular day, significantly smaller than what we turned out. It was maybe several hundred for that day. I would say probably the only days that surpassed Realtor Day were the last Timber Unity rally, which was clearly in the thousands. And we'll talk a little bit about that towards the end.
Cool. So we'll talk now about a lot of the bills that we focused on. A lot of them are housing focused. This is a list of bills that focused on housing supply. Who's familiar with 2001? Okay. Yeah. So 2001 was a major piece of legislation that will, for if you're a city with more than 25,000 people, as soon as the bill goes into effect, which will be in 2022, after cities write their regulations around this, a lot that was zoned for single-family use will be able to have built on it a duplex, triplex, quadplex, townhome, or cottage cluster. If it's a city with 10,000 to 25,000 population, then it's just a duplex. And if it's below 10,000 population, these new rules don't apply. And it doesn't require any of that. It requires cities to allow for it.
I thought it was between 25,000 or between 10,000 and 25,000. It was allowed to duplex, but under 10,000 didn't affect.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think you said under 10,000.
Oh, I don't think so, but yeah. Nope. And Sean worked quite a bit on this, so maybe you want to chime in a bit.
Yeah, so I presented to CCIM a couple weeks ago and said, who's heard of 2001? And, a third of the room maybe had heard about it. And I said, how many think it's a good idea? And 2 people put their hands up. I think we've got a lot of work to do to explain why it actually is a good idea to increase housing supply in the state. So the state economists about a year ago came out with a figure that we're 155,000 units short for our current population of housing. And that's only going to get worse with time as people continue to move into the state. So we really have sort of been looking for a number of solutions to make sure that the private market can actually help and catch up with this. Historically, the legislature's focused just on subsidized public housing, and they've thrown some money behind it. And you had Metro recently pass a bond that's $600 million that's going to go into housing. $600 million is not going to solve this problem. And so 2001, quite frankly, originally we opposed the bill. The committee was very concerned that anti-growth cities would use these new inflated numbers to no longer expand their urban growth boundaries by saying that every single family lot was now 4 units instead of 1. And so we worked very hard to get additional language in there. The speaker, honestly, at first, this is the speaker's main priority for the session. At first, she was not very willing to concede amendments to her bill. And was not listening to us very well. And then she discovered she had a vote problem. And I sent her a text one day and said, gosh, if only there was somebody who could help you find some votes. And lo and behold, I was meeting with her staff pretty regularly after that on amendments to the bill. So not only did we sort of put safeguards in place around not gaming the system, we got significant improvements in how cities will calculate their buildable land inventory and their housing needs going forward. And right now, they're allowed to do a lot of projections with no real work shown for how they're projecting. And even more problematic, they don't have to look back on those projections and show what actually occurred. Going forward, that's different now. So they're actually going to have to adopt findings for all their projections. They're going to have to show if the development occurred at that level or not, and then justify that in their next round of buildable lands inventory, which determines the urban growth boundary. One sort of example of that I'll give is Metro, which controls the Portland market, 3 years ago determined that student loans were so high that people were never going to buy a house again. And that was the trend. And so they said, all we need is multifamily housing. We don't need any more single-family residential. We can't allow that sort of stuff to continue unfettered. And so it really was a victory to get that in 2001. It's why the lobbyists for Metro, if you guys read Willamette Week, I'm sorry, but the lobbyists for Metro had a headline in Willamette Week that says, "Realtor lobbyist tries to turn Portland into Houston." The median home price in Houston, for the record, is $200,000. In Portland, it's $470,000. It wouldn't be the worst thing in the world to be a little bit more like Houston. That being said, I'd love to say that I have that much power. We are not turning Portland into Houston. And 2003 is sort of a complementary bill to that. This is sort of forcing cities, it's the state looking more at what cities are doing around their housing needs, putting a little more teeth into it to say you've got to actually adequately address all your different types of housing stock there. And I have the fortune of usually getting emails first of who's going to sit on work groups, and so I volunteered Jeremy to sit on the work group for the next 2 years. So he will be intimately involved in 2001 and 2003.
And of course, 2003, I don't think anyone voted against it. Maybe one, I think I saw one person did, but one legislator. But that, I think it'll be a significant improvement in some accountability to help make sure that our local governments are doing their part to alleviate the state's housing shortage. 2001, of course, was quite a bit more controversial, but still passed in a bipartisan fashion. So 534, this requires cities to allow houses to be built on skinny lots. Some cities already do, some don't, but this makes it statewide. And then there was a couple of bills related to sort of grants and loans from the state to support housing development. House Bill 2055, this was a priority that came out of the governor's office and was included in her budget. It's called the Greater Oregon Housing Accelerator Program. And what it is, a pot of money that for grants and loans to go to communities where there is a workforce housing shortage, and there is collaboration going on between employers who are looking to expand, developers who are involved, but perhaps it doesn't quite pencil out, and the cities that are supporting and want to do their part to help accelerate the development. So the bill didn't actually pass, but the program did pass as part of the Oregon Housing and Community Services budget. They put $5 million in it. We were supporting this. It was originally $15 million in the governor's budget, but we'll see how it goes. See if it helps some communities, and then work to increase the funding for that in future sessions. House Bill 2056, similarly, it's around grants and loans, this time, though, for affordable housing development rather than workforce housing. And it changed some of the rules that exist currently in the housing and community service programs around grants and loans for affordable housing that made it a little bit easier to access those.
And just for nomenclature there, affordable housing is 80% of AMI and below. Workforce housing is 80% to 120% of your area median income.
All right, so landlord-tenant. Of course, we got the big kahuna that everyone knows about, the rent control, but we'll talk a little bit about some of the other bills that passed. So 970. This is a bill that that passed that makes it so you cannot a landlord cannot use a previous conviction for marijuana possession to as a factor to exclude a tenant. Of course, that's not illegal anymore in Oregon. I think that bill passed pretty easily through the legislature.
Yeah, it's part of a broader movement to sort of decriminalize just mere possession of marijuana now that it's legal in Oregon. And I think this was one that was reasonable enough. If any of you are from Portland, you know that your commissioner there, Commissioner Udaley, wants to take this sort of stuff much further and have a variety of previous crimes no longer be eligible for consideration when renting to a tenant. Many felonies are no longer going to be eligible if she's successful, including my personal favorite, breaking and entering. So someone who broke in and stole stuff from someone else, of course, is going to take very good care of your place. That's sort of the push we're seeing in the landlord-tenant sphere.
Yeah, and I would expect at the city level and then at the statewide level, this to continue to be a conversation where they want to keep adding, previous convictions and things that you cannot take into account. And it's not just Oregon that's seeing this. I mean, this is happening all over the country, and particularly in the big, in a lot of the larger cities and more left-leaning cities. Senate Bill 484, this prohibits a landlord from charging multiple application fees to a prospective renter who is applying for multiple units through that landlord.
For 60 days. It lasts for 60 days. Then you can do a new fee. But if you manage multiple properties, you're only allowed to do one tenant screening fee for a 60-day window. Did we want to talk about 608, or are we just?
Oh wait, yeah,
we're just glossing through it.
We've been through that. You've seen that webinar already. Yeah.
I'm happy to gloss over it. Actually, I'm not. Some of you in the room, I'm sorry, you've heard this story probably 23 times now. But we were successful in a coalition in stopping rent control and we had worked back in the 90s to put a statewide prohibition on local governments implementing rent control policies. We had seen some pressure building to at least remove that preemption or move towards a statewide system. We stayed pretty unified with our colleagues in the landlord space. So you have sort of the folks who represent the small little landlords via their trade association, and then you have folks who represent the big multifamily companies in their trade association, and we all worked really well together for a number of years, sort of pushing back. And unfortunately, in the 2017 session, we were successful in stopping a bill that Portland Tenants United and SEIU, which is the state's largest public employee union, really wanted around rent control. And this is part of a nationwide push where you've really seen SEIU be the driving force financially behind rent control. They're the ones who pay for people to come down to Salem in buses. They're the ones who fund Portland Tenants United. They do a variety of things, and they've been very influential in the Oregon legislature. So the bill did not pass in 17. There's a longtime Democratic senator named Rod Monroe who was actually a former union member. He was a teacher. He had been a staunch supporter of the unions forever. He made the mistake of investing his entire retirement into a multifamily complex, and that was going to be his retirement. And so he didn't think that rent control was the greatest idea in the world, and he was demonized for it. So Portland Tenants United and the folks at SEIU started picketing at his church. They started picketing at his house. And ultimately, they recruited a former legislator who's a trial lawyer to run against him in a primary, and they won fairly convincingly. And so he was taken out over rent control policies by the Democrats, despite his staunch support of the very unions that funded his campaign. Even the Teachers Association went against him. I didn't realize that rent control was their largest issue too, but they teamed up with their colleagues in the public employee space. And so Rod Monroe got taken out. Leading into the 19 session, one of the landlord groups that represents the small landlords decided that they would go start having conversations with the speaker without informing the rest of the coalition that they were doing that, and ultimately cut a deal before we came into session. their biggest concern was preserving the ability to use no-cause terminations in the first year of tenancy. That was far more important to them than rent control. And so in exchange for keeping that no-cause provision, they agreed to sign off on rent control. And in fact, their executive director was at a coastal summit that Jeremy and I both went to with a number of legislators where he went on and on about how great the bill was. So a little problematic in our fracture there. You have the dynamic of a longtime senator who was very close to the Senate president losing. When I heard about the deal before we got in there, I immediately called the majority leader. She was on the beach in Florida. Very nicely, she picked up and answered and said, "Don't worry, Sean, you'll have a chance for amendments. I promise you, you guys have always been great to work with." We roll into the building and they decide it's not going to her committee where it was supposed to go. It went to the very legislator who took out Rod Monroe, Shamia Fagan's committee. It moved the very first day without any amendments even being considered. Everyone who came, and we had realtors come from all over the state, were limited to 90 seconds, and that was what we got to see there. So the process around that bill was a travesty. I'm still upset about the process around that bill. And they did a very similar thing in the House. Rolled it right through, no consideration of amendments. We have 2 realtors on the Housing Committee in the House. Their amendments were summarily rejected by this chair because what would they know about the real estate industry? And that's sort of how we ended up with it. So, you know, I had the great pleasure, I say facetiously, to go back to NAR in May to explain how the hell I was the first lobbyist to lose statewide rent control. Unfortunately for me, I have company now. California just passed theirs. California's is at 5% plus CPI. So ours was at 7% plus CPI. I think you will see that movement in the future to lower that number. The Portland Tenants United actually didn't support the bill in the end. They thought it was too lenient. And so we will certainly have to be diligent going forward on the rent control issue. And happy to answer any specifics. Jeremy and I and Michael Van Dyke worked on a FAQ for it. We're constantly updating that. It's on the website. You know, some of the issues around that bill will probably be resolved via litigation, unfortunately, because not everything is crystal clear, and it's something we'll.
Yeah, and actually, you know, from the perspective of the realtor, I think that the tenant protection piece and how it potentially impacts a transaction is a key thing that really wasn't discussed a lot because there was no amendments. That wasn't the main point of the legislation. It's a side effect that is unintended but negative, and we're hoping that there's some changes we can make in the future, but because there wasn't really willingness to have a discussion, we weren't able to do that. But we're very curious from you all actually about how that's playing out. Yeah.
I'm in escrow right now, set to close the middle of this month, and the seller has 2 tenants. One that rents out a shop and one that rents out an RV space on the same property. And he gave him 90 days notice when we went into agreement. Both tenants would like to stay. He doesn't want to negotiate. The buyer doesn't want to negotiate until the appraisal comes through. And so the buyer knows that he's got the property, so he doesn't want to have any voice with the tenants. The seller's saying, I got to give you the 90 days because I'm counting on it to go through.
Yeah.
Now, the buyer can only increase the 7%, is that right? If he keeps them or wants to renegotiate the contract.
If he keeps them, then yeah, it's 7% plus CPI.
Okay,
Yeah.
so he can't just come in and say, look, you know, you've been renting this shop, this 2,000 square foot shop for $300 a month because this guy's done you good for the last few years, but now I'm going to, you know, bring you up to market square foot price.
So the shop you can rent for whatever you want because it has to be a dwelling unit.
Oh, so we're talking
Yeah.
difference between residential.
Exactly.
This is actually a commercially, this piece of property is zoned, 2 different zonings, commercial and residential.
So
Within one tax.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it's a rural residential, but it's also got RC zoning, which is rural commercial, I believe, and on the footprint of the shop. And now the RV tenant residential zone part. And so the 7% increase applies there?
I'm going to give you an answer, and I'm hesitant to give you an answer on that because I don't personally believe that an RV is deemed residential. So I don't think either one of them is residential and subject to the cap. If it's a manufactured home, for sure, but an RV, no, I don't think so.
It's the tenants-owned RV, which is renting out basically
Right, a space,
the
yeah.
well, the space, the
Yeah.
well, the septic.
Yeah.
And then he's got a house on top of that on the property as well. So he's got these three different potential incomes.
The house is definitely covered.
Yeah.
But he's a tenant.
Right.
And
Yeah.
we should follow up too. That's just like a
Yeah.
good legal hotline question. We should follow up, but we can help you look at the statute and the definitions and
Yeah,
stuff.
but it's
So
interesting because everybody's in limbo waiting on the appraiser. Now, that's a whole nother discussion, but everybody's in limbo on their discussion on these contract, or on these lease negotiations. And, yeah, so.
Yep.
Okay, I have two closings right now on a property I own myself. The closing that I'm concerned about is a property in which the buyer is going to move into. He has given a 90-day notice. He's going to take the tenant there, but he's given a 90-day notice because he's going to move in 6 months out of the year. So how do they quantify that? Because the seller was suspect or worried about the fact that, well, what if the tenant comes back and sees that it's less than 6 months out of the year, and then they have up to a year to say you didn't do this properly, and we want 3 months rent, and then I have a property that is currently rented, but my tenants are moving out. It is a commercially zoned property. It is a company that rents it, and I plan to rent it to the same type of company because it's been hardened for this purpose. It is for, let's see, kids, not kids, but 18 or over that are either mentally or in some other way challenged as a group home. It's a business that's renting it. It's in commercial.
it's got tough questions.
Yeah. It's in commercial
Oh, Lord.
zoning. Does
This
it,
fact pattern gets worse and worse. Continue on.
when I rent it again, will it fall under the new, because it's a residential use, but by a commercial company in commercial zoning?
So
Dwelling.
let's. The first one, as far as the exposure to liability for the seller right now to the new good faith purchaser. The best mechanism for them would be to just get a signed document from the buyer saying, I intend to occupy the property. Seller's done then. It's not seller's job to figure out what's going to happen in the future. If a good faith purchaser tells them they're going to occupy it,
Okay.
that's it. That's their obligation is met. I think that a group home is an allowable use in residential zoned areas, but isn't actually a residential use.
Okay.
So I don't think that you would be covered under the provisions as far as rent
Because
control.
it's a company
Yeah.
that is doing it, right? Okay.
Yep.
I just have a quick comment. I went into escrow almost immediately after the bill was signed on a rental property. We gave the 90-day notice, and it was a long-term tenant. They'd been there like 6 years, always have been great. They took till day 89 at about 9 o'clock to get out and left it destroyed. So the closing actually took 4 months from the time we opened escrow. So I think it's great.
And the tenant advocates will say that's just a made-up story. No renter has ever destroyed anything.
Do you foresee an adjustment on that 90-day notice?
So that's a great question. We actually had amendments in the House about 10 years ago, the Landlord Tenant Coalition, which was a group of landlords and tenant advocates who worked together on legislation, agreed on extending to 60 days notice for tenants over a year. But as part of that negotiation, I was able to keep it at 30 days for these good faith purchasers who intend to occupy the home. It was always the intent that if you're a good faith purchaser, you want to move in the house, you should be able to do that quickly. You keep what was existing law of 30 days. They completely obliterated that with this bill without even really consulting with us. And so we had an amendment drafted to restore it. The lawyer for legal aid went up and said, there's no way there's going to be any problems with this. They can just pay the tenant more to get out earlier. Basically, extortion. We are going to try and compile as many of these stories as possible, because I'd really like to go back to that 30-day provision that we had. Because remember, it's from an accepted offer. This isn't that you've put it on the market and you've gotten all the way to accepted offer. Person wants to occupy the house. We've also heard a lot of stories about FHA and VA loans effectively being pushed away from these properties because they can't abide by that 90-day timeline. So that's really the stories that we want, because, not that landlords aren't empathetic, but if a veteran comes in and talks about how they couldn't use their VA loan because of this, I think that will really have fruit in the legislature. We're talking, and we're still having conversations about trying to address it in the short session in a couple of months. The problem we're running into is that the housing chairs right now don't want to open the bill back up because the tenant advocates are pushing so strongly to make additional changes. So we got to sort of thread that needle. They want to lower it. They think 7% is way too high.
And with California just passing theirs at
Yeah.
lower.
So
They also hate the exclusion for relocation payments for 4 or fewer units. They'd like to get rid of that.
as a rental property owner, and I think a lot of them, when they have a good tenant in there, they don't want to jack up the rents. They've got someone in there who's taking good care of it. But now you're almost forced to do those continuous rent increases because it devalues your property when you go to sell it. So kind of an unintended consequence is rent going up
Exactly.
for people where they
Basically,
might
what
not.
I tried to convey to them in the legislature is you just authorize every landlord in the state to raise their rent by 9.9% next year. Everyone knows exactly what the number is. We publicize it now. And so, yeah, if you're a landlord right now, you probably should be doing that.
But what'll happen, they're going to track that data and revisit this, and there'll be two separate conclusions that people draw. We'll all draw the conclusion that, like we told you, rent control doesn't work, and this is not the right approach. And others will say, oh, it's just too high.
Yeah.
So yeah, exactly. They are going to raise it by whatever. So let's lower it to 1 or 2 or 3. So we'll have that fight again, even with the data that shows what you are talking about.
But when you have a change in tenant, you can increase it.
You can't.
Yeah.
If it's the
Which is
tenant-
another thing people don't like about the bill.
They
though.
hate that
The tenants
part.
don't like that.
They want it to be true rent control where it sticks with the property.
Existing tenant have first right of refusal, though? You can't just, like this buyer on my property, he can't evict, have those tenants evicted and then go and just re-rent.
No. It's only if legally they.
You have a landlord-based reason to do it.
Yeah.
And you're correct on the landlord-based reason. If it comes back up, so let's say you're doing a significant renovation, you're supposed to go track down that tenant and say, hey, you get first right at renting it again.
Okay, I was going to ask some of the same questions. So, investment property is for sale, an investor wants to buy it. Do they have to keep that tenant, even if they're going to use it as a rental? Do they have to keep the tenant that is there? Okay,
Yep.
on the sales agreement, it does ask, do you plan to keep the current tenant? It does give you the option on the sales agreement, so you could say, no, I don't want that tenant. Basically, I'm going to go get my own tenant.
If the tenant's been in less than a year, then yes, you could issue a no-cause notice under the bill, pay relocation payment, and you could
So
have
the
that tenant
buyer
out.
or the seller?
The buyer, when they take on the property.
But can they do it where they don't? So on the sales agreement, it says, do you take on the tenant, basically after it closes?
Yeah, unless you have a landlord-based reason, and there's about 4 of them in there, significant renovation, family members moving in, you intend to occupy the home, you cannot get rid of that tenant if they've been there for over a year.
Okay.
How long, let's say, let's say you decide the buyer decides, no, I don't want the tenants. And they give the 90-day notice to evict, house closes. Boom, tenants are gone. 6 months later, he wants to rent it. Or a year later, is there a minimum time frame that property has to sit empty or occupied by the buyer, by the new owner, before it can be a rental property again and not give first right of refusal?
Yeah, the landlord-based reasons have differing timelines, right? So if it's you intend to occupy it. I don't, hopefully no one's going to track you down immediately if you decide down the line to do that. The seller, go back to sort of the example I give, get a document signed by the buyer saying I intend to occupy. Then the seller's off the hook. The seller did everything that they knew they were supposed to do. They sold to a good faith purchaser. They got assurances from that buyer. So they're off the hook. I don't know what the legal recourse is going to be against the buyer if the seller's the one who gave that 90-day notice for that one. Now, buyer, though, purchasing investment property with an existing tenant, if they're there over a year, they're there until they decide to leave or they do something tenant-based that's wrong. But the seller's not necessarily going to give 90 days if it's just going to another investment property. You can't get around it that way, right? The 90 days is for a good faith purchaser who intends to occupy. Yeah.
What if seller wants to evict the tenant, do a renovation, and sell it?
They can do that, but it has to be significant renovation that would be uninhabitable.
And they'll pay the relocation.
Yeah.
It depends on if they have 4 units or less.
So what if they have, let's say they have 4 units or less? Can that be done?
If the renovation is truly significant renovation, that would require the tenant to be
Gone.
to be gone.
In order
Now,
to
but
do
Sean,
that.
you mentioned though this provision about having to find a tenant, how to find that tenant again after you've done the renovation.
Well, but in
And
your
what-
fact
and-
pattern,
and
they're
then
selling
this-
it. They're not re-renting it out.
Right, and then is there a cap on now, the previous tenant was paying X amount of dollars, there's been a renovation, it's sold, is there a cap on what can be charged?
Now that would be a
No.
new tenant, so they could reset the rent.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Isn't this law great?
This is. Yeah. No, keep it going. I gotta. Yeah.
Okay, so you have one of the 4 reasons.
Yep.
The tenant you move out is the tenant that ruined it, that you had to do the repairs for in the first place. And you're saying you have to go back and try to find that tenant and see if they want to move back in?
Let me double check on whether or not that provision stayed in the bill. I think it's still in there. I
Okay,
honestly
but
do.
there is still
yeah, I didn't recall
for
it.
cause.
There is. So
That's for cause.
that one you're going to say tenant destroyed property. It was a for cause eviction at that point. Then you're no longer on the hook for
Okay.
for tracking them down. I mean, that's going to happen a lot more now. Landlords are going to have to document every single little thing that tenants do wrong, and we're just shifting to a totally for cause, which is going to look worse on their credit histories and rental histories too.
So, when you are getting a new tenant, are you saying you can reset the price to market value, or that cap is
Yeah.
still in?
No, with a
you
new
can
tenant,
reset
you
it.
can reset.
New tenant, you can reset?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't think that was actually included in the California bill, so that is one area where ours is a little better.
Don't have the 7% plus.
Correct.
Yeah.
That is good.
Yeah.
Yeah. But there will be future legislative fights over that. I guarantee it.
Yep.
The tenants' rights activists will go after that for
Yeah.
sure.
So we had a similar situation that they did in Florence recently, only it was a retiree. The tenant refused to move out until like the last day. The retiree was out of a place to live because she'd moved out of her house, expecting to move in, and for probably a few weeks, she was out of a place to live. But there was nothing really we could do. The other thing was, if for cause is still allowed, can we just beef up our leases? I mean, put everything you can imagine in the lease, and then if they break the lease, you have cause.
There are certain provisions in ORS Chapter 90 of what you can and can't have as far as those things. I'd look at all of those first.
And then
still-
there are specific notification requirements in the legislation as well, like around documentation, how many times that you've given them a written notification of something happening, and so,
And they do have a right to remedy,
yeah.
too. So if it's because they have a cat and they're not supposed to have a cat, they have a right to get rid of the cat.
Right.
Unless it's a service animal.
The service cat.
Then it doesn't count as an animal, it's just a service.
But you do have to have a prescription for a service.
You do. But they're pretty easy to get. A psychologist can write one. Sorry if anyone's a psychologist. Okay.
All right. That was good.
What about, I'm sorry, what about companion pet as opposed to service? Like emotional support? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it has to be a service animal. It's defined pretty broadly in Oregon, a service animal is. It's been a little while since I dug into that statute, but
But that service animal has to be under control at all times.
My understanding.
I heard you can get certification though online, so
yeah.
So that they don't have to be under control?
I'm not really sure.
And
They
it can be
don't-
a horse or a monkey
It
or a.
can. It could be a miniature horse. There are
Yeah.
a lot of these stories.
Yeah.
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 Miniature horse. You can't charge a pet deposit because it's not a pet. It's a service animal.
Service iguana.
Yeah. Yeah, little monkeys. I mean, honestly, there's a lot of these stories. The moral to the story is stop investing in Oregon. Sorry.
Hey.
No, I didn't at all.
Idaho's
But you live on the
beautiful, man.
border of California, so I'm not sure it's any better.
Yeah.
So this is great. I didn't know we'd be learning about service animal law. It's good. So House Bill 3349, this was the mortgage interest deduction phase out. So this bill would have done two things. It didn't pass. Sean Cleve, who was here at the time, did an excellent job making sure that it didn't go forward. Of course, this is something that comes up almost every session and will keep coming up. But this particular bill would have eliminated mortgage interest deduction for second homes, and then would have started phasing it out for taxpayers who earn over $200,000 a year. So I think it was if you're between 200 and 250, it would sort of ramp down, and then over 250, it would just be eliminated.
And we've seen this bill for a few sessions. The chair of the Housing Committee is very interested in it. She did manage to get it out of committee this time, but we got it referred to a second committee where we killed it. It would blow you away to see the advocates come in and make statements like, well, someone who makes $100,000 a year doesn't need any help buying a house. It's like, do you realize how much houses cost? Yes, someone still needs a mortgage interest deduction. And we've seen the threshold in these bills as low as $75,000. There was one that would have disallowed any property tax deductions if you made $75,000 a year. It really is just sort of a crazy trend in the Oregon legislature between the Housing Committee and the Revenue Committee. Yep. So it's been different in different bills. Sometimes it was single filers at $100,000, $200 for joint. This last version, because I beat up on them so much on the single and joint, they just made it any filer over $200,000. She thought maybe that was more tenable. So it could be either. It's however you file, that's the income threshold. The chair feels very strongly that I'm not representing the interests of you all, and that if she can just talk to you, you'll want to understand. She's met with Jenny at least 3 different times too, where Jenny has told her, no, Sean's right, our members really don't want to touch mortgage interest deduction. And as part of the presidential advisory group, we talked to people, our membership wide, how important is mortgage interest deduction is one of the top issues. And so I'm happily armed with that. Going back this next session. But we will see it again. I assure you that bill will come back this session.
What's interesting about Oregon in this is that when the federal tax law changes happened, and it really hurt a lot of blue states that had a lot of higher income taxpayers with a lot of itemized deductions, and they did a cap on state and local income tax deduction in the federal tax law. They did a cap on the mortgage interest deduction they lowered it for the size of the mortgage. And most blue states, their state legislatures tried to figure out how to help their taxpayers because they were kind of getting screwed by this federal law. Whereas in Oregon, it's sort of
Trying
the
to make it worse.
opposite. They're just trying to make it worse.
Yeah.
So in New York and Illinois and other places, actually, we're looking at ways. Well, gosh, this kind of how do we help some of these taxpayers who aren't going to benefit as much from the itemized deductions?
Do you know where we rank in overall tax compared to the rest of the states?
So in personal income tax, we're the third highest in the nation, behind Hawaii and California. And so the deduction is very meaningful when you're paying 9 or 9.9%, because effectively we go to 9% if you make any money whatsoever. Our tiers are so low. It's interesting on that note, and Jeremy sort of touched on it too, with the federal changes in doubling the standard deduction, only about 20% of Oregonians are itemizing anymore on their federal taxes, but almost 50% of Oregonians still itemize on their Oregon taxes. And so we really do utilize the property tax deduction, the mortgage interest deduction, those incentives for home ownership.
Yeah, but I think the legislature will continue to go after limiting itemized deductions in Oregon,
Yeah.
and they'll say, well, gosh, no one's even doing this at the federal level anymore. Why not? Yeah, we're high on personal income. We're in the we don't have a sales tax, obviously, and we're sort of in the middle. We were sort of in the middle on business tax. We just passed a new huge business tax. We also passed those insurance premium taxes and other things to pay for Medicaid. Who knows? We may soon pass carbon tax or something like that. And over the last few sessions, there's just been a lot of little things. So if you look at the trends, like the Oregon's ranking in the overall tax picture is going up and up. And I think when you see a study 5 years from now, we're going to sort of be in the top tier sort of overall.
We were only 1.4 billion in the hole because of
See, this
But
is,
they wanted
this
to
is where you
add
get the
more.
bipartisan nature here. You and I say Obamacare, he says Affordable Care Act, right? So I thought it was perfect when he was describing it.
So the reason why I do that is because I thought once Obama called it Obamacare, I thought it was no longer like a pejorative term. You just call it that. I was doing one of these things and I said Obamacare, and someone came at me for it. So I said, okay, I'm not gonna do that. Yeah. But the reason here's the you're correct. But the additional one thing is they wanted to not just hold the line; they wanted to increase their investment in education significantly, right? So when they pass this business tax, we're going to talk about, they're adding $2 billion on top, more, right? So you're growing the size of Oregon government by $2 billion, not just trying to break even with where you have a hole. And then they don't like to talk about it, but the PERS cost and that piece that just keeps eating away at the available dollars is just. It's like a Pac-Man, so.
Septic wood stoves.
Yeah, so septic, Oregon passed, we supported the Realtors program to help assist homeowners with repairing, replacing septic systems and or hooking up to city sewers. And there was an effort this session to expand that program, to add some additional dollars, to create additional options around low interest or no interest loans to make it more accessible to more people to access this funding assistance from the state. So that expansion didn't pass. The program's still out there. It's available. If you go to the DEQ website, you can learn about it. A company called Craft3 administers the program. Homeowners can apply, get the upfront costs as a loan, and pay it back over time. But we're going to continue in future legislations, including 2020, to try to get that program expanded so it's even more accessible, particularly to low-income taxpayers.
And Jeremy and I just got an email on it. Looks like there's a pretty good coalition trying to work in 20 to get some of that money. The flip side of that, too, is wood stove replacement. So you all know we have a wood stove mandate where you have to remove and destroy non-compliant stoves. We've advocated for years that the best time to actually do that's not the point of sale, it's when the people are actually living in the property. And so we have a Heat Smart program that was originally put together to give folks grants or loans to replace their wood stoves while they're living there. When they originally set it up, there was no money in it. It's a great program. And then we got some federal money put in there. We've used all that up. Primarily, it's just gone to areas of non-attainment, so Klamath Falls, Oak Ridge, they tend to get the vast majority of the resources. But Washington County now is becoming very close to non-attainment status. Intel is greatly concerned about that because they would have to halt production on days that they reach non-attainment. And so Intel has been willing to put some private dollars in as well. We managed to get some matching state dollars in there as well. Yep. I think we're okay. So the question was, when are they going to go after fireplaces? I actually came on right when we first passed the Heat Smart portion of the bill, and there wasn't I mean, they want fireplace inserts to go into fireplaces, but there's not a strong push for that right now, thankfully. Yeah. Yeah.
But you are
I mean,
seeing more instances
as soon
where
as
you,
we get a carbon tax, you'll be taxed on your piece of wood that goes into there, and you won't be able to afford to burn wood anymore anyway. But
So there's quite a few like land use related bills that passed or were worked on during this legislative session. 2469. So this allows a second dwelling for a relative on a forest zoned piece of property if the relative is assisting with the forest operations. So relatively limited application, but sort of some progress on allowing some additional development. 2225, Sean's going to talk about this one.
no, Jeremy's going to talk about it.
This is the forest template dwelling bill. So Oregon has a forest template dwelling statute, which defines in certain instances where you own a property that's forest zoned property, instances where you're able to build a home, and there's been a lot of confusion, I guess, or debate about how to define those properties and when and where you can build a home. This was supposedly an attempt to clarify that, but really ended up sort of just making it harder, sort of restricting the ability to build a forest template dwelling. A lot of technical stuff in there about trying to figure out where the center of the tract is, which is a key factor in determining when and where you can build. And then some additional restrictions that were put in there. And then also a kind of strange tiered structure where it goes into effect for some counties immediately, some counties in a year, some counties a couple years from now.
Questions on that? Come
Yeah.
on, guys. This is
Are you Michael Lang, Curry County Board of Realtors,
Yeah.
Curry County, the sticks, where nobody goes to. Adam, you came down there actually. Thanks. Thank you for representing. Forest grazing is a thorn in our side. And are you alluding to the grid test then? Is that what you're talking about? Where you have to have so many neighboring properties that already have houses on them in order to get your conditional use permit? Because that's part of the process right now with forest grazing, to try and even build on. And if you do build on it, you can only build on one little section of it.
I think this has to do with if you had a right to build a home as of 1993, and there's been law changes, and so this was trying to protect a right to build a home that existed at that time under certain conditions. And it was like 1993 was the cutoff date. And it said, okay, if you have a tract of land and the center of the tract is, has these conditions and the size of the property and a whole bunch of different factors, then if you had a right to build there in 1993, you still can build a home there. And this sort of redefines how you calculate that. So I think it's a little bit different than what you're talking about.
And it makes it a lot more difficult to do lot line adjustments to make them conforming lots.
I'm going to ask just one real quick off-tangent question and then let you field more questions on this one. Are you going to get to House Bill 2333 with the park models under 400 feet today?
We can talk about it. It's
This
not on
is
our
a
list,
tough-
but
this is a tough
we can talk
crowd.
about it.
Okay.
Yeah, and I know that that's a big deal for you. I've been reading the news stories about it, and we've been.
We've got a little additional thing that I just talked to some folks in. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's some issues with manufactured homes, park models specifically, sort of got swept into tiny home regulation. And then now there's another issue I was just aware of, that building codes stopped publishing online where manufactured homes were originally placed to, when you're trying to loan on both the real property and the manufactured home. So let's talk offline, because I literally
Okay.
just had that conversation too. We're gonna have to dig in with building codes about what they're doing and why they thought they should stop doing certain things, and we're gonna have to probably get a legislator engaged too.
88, so this would allow a ADU to be built on a rural residential lot, which we supported strongly. We worked with the Association of Oregon Counties and other groups on this. There was a work group in the interim that came forward to come up with a statute on this. And it really is an equity issue. I mean, we've passed bills that allow ADUs in urban areas. We think that they should be allowed in rural residential as well. But it got hung up. It ended up getting a fiscal note attached to it. There was discussion about the need to do wildfire risk mapping, and have that as a factor in this. If someone's going to build an ADU, kind of knowing where those risks exist, and that cost money. Got attached to the bill, went to Ways and Means, and it didn't get prioritized for funding. So we're going to continue to work on this. We're going to push it in 2020, try to keep that funding element separate and out of it so the policy can pass. 2436. Which one was that one? Oh, this is wetlands. Yeah. So for those of you who are interested in wetlands policy, of course, Oregon has a lot of wetlands. Affects the ability to build, whether you're talking about residential, industrial, commercial. This bill passed. It is taking the initial steps of Oregon assuming the wetlands permitting process from the federal government. That's an option under the Clean Water Act to do that. And Oregon has said it wants to take a look at that. So it doesn't actually assume the program. It sets up a group to write the rules for the program and start pursuing a agreement with the federal government to assume that permitting program. And then if you're also interested in wetlands, there was another bill that passed, 2437, the ditch bill. There's been a lot of concern among farmers in the state of Oregon and across the country, but particularly here around ditches and what they can do and whether they're all of their ditches are regulated under the wetlands regulation. So this created some more flexibility and allowed for some exclusions to the wetland permitting process for farmers who are dealing with ditches.
And it was in the press quite a bit because this is one of the revenge bills from the governor. When she said, I'm going to get revenge on the Senate Republicans for leaving, this was one of the bills. Ultimately, there are a number of Democrats who supported the bill, too, who went and talked to her so that it didn't get vetoed on the last day.
So this one is something that's going to keep coming back. This was the independent contractor bill. So this would have redefined the definition of independent contractor as opposed to employee. We know this is very important to all of you and to our industry. What the key change would have been that if the work being performed was sort of a customary core part of the business, then you'd be considered an employee, not an independent contractor. So that is a huge step, a huge difference. Right now, the test is all about control, right? Is the employer controlling the manner and means in which you're doing your work, and are you an independently established business as a consultant? Those are the things that they look at. This would totally break things open and significantly limit the amount of individuals who could be considered independent contractors. And we were in a position at OAR where we didn't think that we'd get swept up in it. We think we could have gotten a exemption specifically for realtors. And if you look at the California bill that just passed, and it was, most of the discussion around the bill is around the gig economy, Uber drivers, things like that. California passed sweeping legislation with a similar test that would bring in all the Uber drivers, gig economy workers. But they included a specific exemption for realtors. So this is an issue that certainly is going to come back. It's going to be a really huge debate. You'll have a lot of Democrats in the legislature that want to see Oregon pass something similar to California. The public employee unions and the private unions perhaps will be pushing hard on it. And so I think our role will be to continue to help people understand why realtors just get a carve out. But we also will be working with our other business community partners to hopefully just prevent the whole bill, because it has significant impacts on the business community generally, and the ability of businesses to and individuals who want to structure their relationship in a certain way to be able to do that.
Yeah, this session really was the session of coalitions were so important if you were going to be successful in stopping legislation. So as Jeremy Sorner pointed out, we could have gotten our exclusion. The chair has been pretty receptive to it, but we just sort of stayed with everyone else in the business community stopping the bill. The true background on this is AFL-CIO represents cab drivers. Cab drivers hate Uber and Lyft. And so this is really what started this big fight. And when he introduced the bill, I don't think he realized how sweeping it would be, but basically it eliminated every independent contractor in the state. They all became employees. Paul Holvey is the chair, and he tells this story about, well, it's not just about Uber and Lyft, it's about subcontractors and construction. And, you know, I know this sheetrock contractor who works for the same general contractor all the time. And I said, have you talked to the subcontractor? Does he feel like he's an employee of the general? No, he thinks he owns his own business because he owns his own business. You're trying to help someone who doesn't even want help. Well, that's not, I'm like, you're trying to help someone who doesn't want help. You all think you're small business owners, not an employee of your brokerage. There's a pride in being a small business owner.
We're employees of our clients.
Yeah.
We work for our clients.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting to me too, just with the Uber drivers. I mean, I always do the experiment. Anytime I take a lot of Ubers, I ask my driver, what do you think of this? I've yet to meet a driver who said they want to be an employee. Now, I'm sure there are some that do, but you would think that part of the decision-making process here would actually be to like survey Uber drivers to figure out what they want before you like go to the mat on like game-changing legislation around this, but that's not happened. There was some discussion in California about you know, the Uber and the gig economy companies came in and said, look, you know, let's not go all the way to classifying them as employees, you know, but we'll work with you on some stuff, like including, you know, letting them unionize but not having them be employees, because that's a huge driver is the unions. This is a major growth opportunity for the unions. But down there wasn't any interest in talking about compromises, so I'm curious as this goes forward in Oregon, what kind of discussions will be had around compromises on that.
Yeah, and you know, that bill in California is going to be subject of litigation for sure. Uber and Lyft have already said they're going to seek an injunction that they're not going to comply because they simply can't. It would end Uber and Lyft. And we heard the other day that Uber, Lyft, and Grubhub immediately put $100 million into a PAC to do a ballot measure to overturn the law. So we shall see. I don't even know what that is. Let's go to the next one.
Just so you know, there was as we mentioned, there was a lot of housing discussion, a lot of the bills that we talked about, and pretty significant ones. I mean, 2001 and rent control, probably the biggest housing things that passed in the country until California just passed its thing. But there was also just a lot of focus on the budgets of the Oregon Housing Community and Services Department. I think there's probably an additional, in total, $300 to $400 million additional money put in. I talked about a couple of those programs earlier around workforce and affordable housing, but also a ton on related to homelessness prevention and assistance, and some other programs as well. And we'd expect that to continue to be an area where you're going to see some increased investment. All right, other notable stuff. So we kind of talked about 2020. We didn't. So these are issues we didn't work on as a core part of our work. They helped define the legislative session. A lot of our partners were working on them, but they weren't issues where our membership had a clear, we had clear direction to get in the fray on them. But Sean, of course, through his other role, was very involved with 2020. So maybe you can tell us what's going to happen next on that.
So House Bill 2020 is cap and trade. And I must have missed a meeting one day because somehow I got in charge of the coalition opposing the bill, or at least seeking significant changes on it. As Jeremy mentioned, we sort of had members on both sides of the issue. I had some members coming to us saying we absolutely should oppose this. We drive around in our cars all the time, 22 cents a gallon on day one is more than we can afford. We had other members in other parts of the state, not Curry County, saying we love the earth, you're evil, Jillians, why can't we support cap and trade? So we decided as a government affairs committee, let's just stay out of the issue. It certainly was the defining issue. The Oregon 11, the senators who ultimately left the state and were on Fox News and talking to folks back in Oregon. I have no idea who they were talking to, but my personal favorite on that one is Herman Barrett Sugar. So it's later in the time that they're gone, and Cliff Bentz, who basically lives in Idaho already, had gone over to Idaho, and he's admitting that he's in Idaho, and he does an interview, and he says, oh, yeah, I'm in Boise. I don't know where any of the other senators are. And Herman Barrett Sugar, the leader, does an interview right after that, and he goes, oh, my phone's dying. Hey, Bentz, give me your phone so I can get on. It's like, okay, guys, very cloak and dagger. They may or may not have purchased burner phones, and we're trying to figure out because they were afraid that their phones were being tracked. On one of the final days I was with Senator Barrett Sugar, and he looked at me and he said, Sean, we got to write a book about this. And I said, honestly, no one will believe it. It really was a crazy sort of paradigm. I think ultimately what happened with cap and trade, though, is while there was a lot made about the Oregon 11 and the senators leaving and the governor calling the state police on them, they didn't have the votes in the Senate to pass the bill. The proponents of the bill were so confident that they could ram something through, and they wanted to do it early in the session, and they were frustrated that they couldn't, and so they didn't listen to their rural counterparts, Arnie Roeblen from the coast, Lee Byer from Springfield, Betsy Johnson from the coast. They wouldn't listen to their concerns about what the impacts would truly be on rural Oregon, and even the most glossy of promotions for the bill recognize that rural Oregon disproportionately got hurt by the bill because rural Oregonians drive further to get places. They rely on industries that are more energy dependent, and those jobs are limited compared to what's available in Portland and other places. And so you sort of saw this urban and rural divide sort of split really wide. I was telling the story last night to someone from Vernonia that this movement, Timber Unity, that the proponents say is all funded by big oil and is, this corrupt sort of thing. It was literally 15 guys. We're all standing outside the House chamber. So when the legislature's in the House, we can stand outside the chamber as lobbyists, and we pass notes, and they'll come out and talk to us and go back in. And so a few of us always hang out outside the House. And 15 guys show up, and they're kind of standing off to the side, and they've got their suspenders on, and we're kind of like, y'all aren't from around here, are you? And one of my colleagues walks up and says, hey guys, what are you doing here? And they said, we heard about this cap and trade bill. They were log truck drivers. They said, it'd be terrible for our industry. We're really concerned. So they grabbed me. I start talking to them and said, here's the things you should highlight. Talk about your own personal experiences. And then I just grabbed one of them and said, where are you from? Oh, I'm from Gresham. So we put in a note to the legislator from Gresham. I said, hey, one of your constituents is here, wants to talk to you. Pull them out. That's literally how Timber Unity started. 15 guys who organized on Facebook. That turned into, in the last week of session, 3,000 people showing up. The line of log trucks, bale wagons, John Deere tractors, you name it, went for 6 straight hours around the Capitol. It's the most amazing thing I've ever seen around that building. And despite the pokes about California, native Oregonian right here, I just happened to go to college down in California and then saw the light and came back. So, it was an amazing display. Betsy Johnson, so we set up a pop-up tent outside and put coffee and donuts for people, because literally they were stuck in their tractors for an hour or two at one point. And Betsy Johnson came over to watch with us, and she said, yeah, I showed up at the building this morning, and 2 log trucks had blocked the entrance from where the legislators should get in. And she pulls up and she says, hey, boys, you want to move that truck? And the guy goes, why should we? And she said, because I'm a no on that bill. The truck's opened right up, and she pulled in. So it really provided a lot of entertainment, even for folks who weren't closely working the issue. It certainly took a big bulk of the legislative session. Are we going to see it in the short session again? I think it's likely. Unfortunately, the conversations I've had with the committee chairs who were there sort of guiding the bill, the first time they seem unwilling to concede that there were any problems with the bill and don't seem to be looking for amendments. They're convinced that they would have had the votes if senators would have been forced to the floor. I don't agree with that view, but we'll sort of see how it plays out. The Senate president hasn't been as strong in saying it's exactly going to be that bill. So it'll be curious sort of to see. I had the opportunity to take the governor on tours in Douglas County and in Lane County to some sawmills and other facilities and sort of have a coalition of folks talk about all the concerns there. Timber Unity showed up too. It was kind of cool. They found out about it, freaked out at first, and then sort of realized it was probably better just for them to be there and sort of have a presence while she was going through there. Yeah. I mean, I told someone the other day when I saw it, it's like I get goosebumps thinking about that. My personal favorite, I didn't tell you guys this one, there was a guy in a Jetta, and he had cut a log and duct taped it onto his roof and was cruising around with all the trucks to fit in. It wasn't Jeremy, though. He drives a Kia.
Yeah, I do. So, Sean, this is like an itch that some people feel like they need to scratch. So if it fails in 2020, it's going to come back in 2021, and it's going to keep coming back forever. Is there a way for the itch to get scratched that won't be as bad for the economy and that folks can just get this done and move on?
Yeah, I mean, at one point in time, there actually were amendments that were drafted by Senator Johnson. And so she likely still wouldn't have voted for it because she really thinks that it's the most potentially damaging bill that she's ever seen in her career. But they were sort of crafted by all aspects of the economy that are regulated. So you have the transportation sector, you had utilities, you had manufacturing, you had the farmers and forest landowners. You really had everyone sort of coming together on these omnibus amendments. Ultimately, those amendments were rejected. And so I think I have said, and I told this to the governor directly, the failure of the bill is on the proponents, not on the opponents. We offered solutions, you refused to accept them. And I believe that. I think the governor's office, to an extent, understands that. Now, whether or not they push back on the proponents who want, no concessions and no amendments to it is TBD. I think the other thing is you've got Ontario pulled out of the cap and trade system. You've got California still sitting there by themselves. They're the only state in the U.S. that has an economy-wide cap and trade system. They've lost one of their Canadian partners. They have 2 other Canadian partners, and that's it. Those are the only entities that are doing cap and trade. You had a potential carbon tax fail in Washington pretty overwhelmingly, and so I think people absolutely want to do something on carbon. There's no doubt about that. When we do polling, and we did 6 different polls during session, 70+% of people said we should be doing something about carbon. But when we talked about cap and trade, the highest the support ever was 51%. And when we talked about the cost impacts to everyday Oregonians, the support was at 35%. So while I think they feel politically, well, and this is another part of sort of the inside baseball of the building, they put an emergency clause on the bill for a program that's running through 2050 and wouldn't have even gone into effect for 3 years, but they put an emergency clause on, and the reason they put an emergency clause is then you can't refer it to the voters, because they know if the voters actually got a hold of the bill, they would not support cap and trade.
Question back there?
Yes, sorry. Before we adjourn, can you guys talk about SB2, the Eastern Oregon
Yep.
Economic Development, and clarify that?
Yeah, so this is something that's been talked about for a while. There's been a lot of discussion about, and a lot of concern that our land use system is applying rules across the state that don't necessarily make sense for certain parts of the state. And so what if we were to give some more flexibility to some of the Eastern Oregon counties that don't have a lot of high-value farmland, that are really desperate for more economic development opportunities? So this bill would allow for the 10 Eastern Oregon counties to each take 50 acres outside of the UGB and pursue development opportunity on that land without having to go through the typical land use process and bring that land into the UGB and go through all of that. So there was some funding to assist counties to help implement it that didn't get, that ultimately didn't go through. I think the governor vetoed that. But it was a significant step forward, at least symbolically, to show that Eastern Oregon counties just kind of throw a bone to some Eastern Oregon counties.
And I just add that this actually was Senate President Peter Courtney's priority to get through, which was great to see someone from the Valley sort of recognizing the need for it. He took a lot of heat for introducing the bill the last couple of sessions and really was not getting anywhere with his caucus moving it forward. So it is rather limited. I mean, we're talking about 500 total acres in the state of Oregon, but the land use advocates would tell you we just destroyed the entire state, right? I'm turning Portland into Houston. That bill just destroyed all of Oregon with 500 acres.
All right, I think we are at time. So thank you all so much.
Yeah,
Appreciate it.
thanks for being interactive, guys. Really helped.